Hi guys. Today we're going to be reading with props, and we're going to be reading the story Cinderella. Sometimes props help us to understand the story better. It may keep us more interested in the story. So the prop I'm going to use today is a crown. Let me get my crown on. Okay, so Cinderella. Story adapted by Nikki Grimes. Once upon a time, a wealthy widower lived in a fine house with his daughter. He loved his daughter, Cinderella, very much and gave her beautiful dresses, a fine horse, and even a puppy. Still, he felt that Cinderella should have a woman's care. So he married a woman with two young daughters who were just about Cinderella's age. Sadly, the gentleman died soon after, and Cinderella discovered that her stepmother was a cold and cruel woman. She was jealous of Cinderella's charm and beauty, for her own daughters, Anastasia and Drizella, were quite ugly. As years passed, Cinderella's stepmother spoiled her two daughters with pretty gowns and jewels. Anastasia and Drizella slept in large, lovely bedrooms, but Cinderella was given a tiny room in the attic with the mice. And while her stepsisters lived like princesses, poor Cinderella was forced to do laundry, serve meals, and clean house, just like a servant. Still, even though she was badly treated, the lovely Cinderella remained kind and gentle. All of the animals loved her. She took special care of her dog, Bruno, and made sure to feed and brush down her old horse each day. Do any of you help take care of your pets at home? Okay. The birds sang to her often, and the mice were always there to keep her company. She made tiny clothes for them, and she often rescued them from traps or from the claws of her stepmother's greedy cat, Lucifer. Early one morning, before Cinderella began her chores, she sat at the window in her tiny room and stared out at the castle in the distance. She dreamed of one day wearing a beautiful gown and dancing at a fancy ball. Someday my dreams will come true, Cinderella said to herself. Suddenly her stepmother rang for her. Coming, stepmother, Cinderella called. Meanwhile, the king had his own troubles. It is time for my son to marry, he told the Grand Duke, his closest adviser, but he insists he must wait for the girl of his dreams. Now, sir, perhaps if we just let him alone, began the Grand Duke. I've got it, interrupted the king. We'll invite all the young women of the kingdom to a ball. That very day, the invitations were sent. When the messenger came to her house, Cinderella answered the door. She took the invitation and gave it to her stepmother. This just arrived from the palace, explained Cinderella. As her mother read the invitation aloud, Anastasia and Drizella jumped with excitement. May I go too? Asked Cinderella. I'm a young woman. Very well, you may go, said her stepmother, if you finish all your chores and find something suitable to wear. Her stepmother's kind of mean, isn't she? Cinderella dressed and hurried downstairs to join her stepsisters, but when they saw that she wore a sash and beads that had once belonged to them, Anastasia and Drizella ripped the gown to shreds while their mother stood silently by. Girls, girls, said their mother once the gown was ripped beyond repair. That's quite enough. It's time to go. Good night, Cinderella. Cinderella ran into the garden, sobbing bitterly. It's just no use, she cried. My dreams will never come true. Suddenly, the garden filled with magic light, and Cinderella looked up to find her fairy godmother. "Come now, dry those eyes," the kindly fairy said. "You can't go to the ball looking like that." "The ball? But I can't go anyway," said Cinderella. "Of course you can," said her fairy godmother, "but we will have to hurry." With a wave of her wand, the fairy godmother turned a pumpkin into a glittering coach and the mice into 4 porcelain white horses. She waved her wand again and changed the old horse into a fine coachman and Bruno the dog into an elegant footman. Last of all, she transformed Cinderella's rags into a lovely ball gown and put glass slippers on her tiny feet. Cinderella twirled around in her beautiful new gown. "It's like a dream," she said with a sigh. "Yes, my child, but the magic only lasts till midnight," cautioned her fairy godmother. "When the clock strikes 12, the spell will be broken and all will be as it was before." "I understand," said Cinderella, and with that she stepped into the coach and whisked away to the ball. When Cinderella entered the ballroom, the prince rushed to her side and asked her to dance. Cinderella smiled and took his hand, never guessing that he was the prince. They danced together all night long, and anyone who could plainly see that they were falling in love. "Who is she, mother?" said Drizella. She hadn't recognized Cinderella, and neither had her mother. Suddenly the clock began to strike midnight. "Oh dear, I must leave," Cinderella said, breaking away from the prince. "Wait, I don't even know your name. How will I find you?" called the prince. But Cinderella could hear the clock still striking, and she ran out of the ballroom. The Grand Duke tried to stop her. He knew that the prince had finally found the girl he wanted to marry, and the king would be furious if she got away. "Young lady," called the Grand Duke, running after Cinderella. "Young lady, wait!" Cinderella raced down the stairs, and as she raced down the stairs, she lost her glass slipper. The Grand Duke, a few steps behind, stopped briefly to pick it up. When he looked around a moment later, she was gone. Just beyond the palace gates, at the last stroke of midnight, the coach became a pumpkin again. When Cinderella saw her tattered dress and her animal friends, she realized that the spell was broken. Just as the fairy godmother had predicted, all was as it was before. All that is, except for the tiny glass slipper on Cinderella's foot. She took the slipper off and carried it home. The next day, the king was frantic. "We must find the girl who lost the slipper," he told the Grand Duke. "The prince will marry no one else." When Cinderella's stepmother heard the news, she decided that Cinderella must not have a chance to try on the slipper. She quickly locked the girl in her room, but Cinderella wasn't locked in for long. The mice had stolen the key, carried it upstairs, and slipped it under her door. "Oh, thank you," Cinderella said. When Cinderella appeared, Anastasia and Drizella were trying to force their feet into the tiny slipper, but it was no use. Then, just as the Grand Duke was about to leave, Cinderella appeared at the top of the stairs. "May I try it on?" she asked. "Well, of course," said the Grand Duke. As a footman carried the slipper to Cinderella, her stepmother, who was purple with rage, struck her cane out and tripped him. The glass slipper flew into the air and came crashing down onto the floor, shattering in 1,000 pieces. The Grand Duke was horrified, but Cinderella only smiled. "That's all right," she said, pulling a glass slipper from under her apron. "Here is the other slipper. Will this do?" The Grand Duke knelt before Cinderella and eased the slipper onto her dainty foot. It was a perfect fit. Soon Cinderella and the prince were married, and as far as we know, they lived happily ever after. The end.